The thunder of gunfire shattered the autumn silence of Dakota Territory as 6 riders pursued a lone wagon across the windswept prairie. October 15th, 1879, would be remembered as the day when everything changed, though none who lived through it could have imagined the transformation that would follow. Elise Laurent gripped the leather reins with bloodied hands, her father's old mare straining against the harness as bullets whined past her head. The torn blue fabric of her best dress whipped in the wind, and her dark hair had long since escaped its pins to stream behind her like a war banner. Behind her, Victor Thorne's hired killers closed the distance with each thundering stride of their fresh mounts. Her mind flashed back to the previous night when she'd barely escaped Blackjack Murdoch's trap at Willow Creek. She had been watering her horse at what she thought was a safe distance from the main trail when she'd heard the telltale click of a rifle being cocked behind her. "End of the line, missy," Blackjack had said, his scarred face splitting into a cruel grin. Mr. Thorne's been real patient, but even saints got their limits. Elise had pretended to surrender, slowly raising her hands while positioning herself near the creek bank. When Blackjack had stepped closer to bind her wrists, she'd thrown a handful of creek sand in his eyes and rolled backward into the water. The current had carried her downstream in the darkness, while his curses and gunshots echoed through the night. She'd lost her shoes and her traveling cloak, but she'd gained precious hours of lead time. Now, as her exhausted mare stumbled again, Elise felt the weight of her father's final words pressing against her heart. 3 months ago, on the night before his death, Jean-Baptiste Laurent had pressed the leather satchel into her hands with trembling fingers. "Ma petite," he had whispered in the French of her childhood. "If anything happens to me, you must take these papers to the territorial capital. Show them to honest men, to newspaper editors, to anyone who will listen. Victor Thorne is a cancer on this land, and these documents are the only medicine that can cure it." "Papa, you're frightening me," she had protested. "Nothing's going to happen. You're just being careful." Her father's weathered hand had cupped her cheek with infinite tenderness. "I have been many things in my life, sherry trader, rancher, sometimes even fool. But I have never been a coward. These papers prove Thorne has been stealing land, murdering competitors, bribing officials. He knows I have them, and he knows I will use them. That makes me dangerous to him." "Then destroy them," Elise had pleaded. "We'll go to California or Oregon, start over somewhere safe. And let him continue killing innocent families, femmes." Jean-Baptiste's voice had grown firm with resolve. "Some things are worth dying for. Justice is one of them. Love for one's daughter is another." The next morning, they'd found her father's body beside his favorite fishing spot, supposedly thrown from his horse. But the horse had returned to the stable uninjured, and there was no explaining the bullet hole Dr. Martineau had discovered during his examination. "There's nowhere to run, girl." Blackjack Murdoch's voice brought her back to the present with violent clarity. The scarred gunman had been tracking her for 3 days, ever since she'd fled Thorne's ranch with the documents that could destroy him. "Mr. Thorne's been real patient, but his patience is wearing thin." A rifle cracked and splinters exploded from the wagon seat beside her. Elise ducked low, tasting dust and terror as she urged the exhausted mare toward the distant line of cottonwoods that marked Ash River. Somewhere in those trees lay sanctuary, if the stories were true, if Beatrice Coyle hadn't been mistaken about the Lakota camp hidden in the river bends. The wagon wheel struck a prairie dog hole with a sound like breaking bones. The entire vehicle lurched sideways, throwing Elise hard against the wooden side before pitching her into the tall grass. She rolled, clutching her father's leather satchel to her chest, and came up running as her mare screamed in terror, tangled in the broken harness. "She's down." Greasy Pete Wheeler spurred his horse forward, drawing his Colt revolver. $5 to whoever brings her back breathing." Elise plunged into the cottonwoods as gunshots erupted behind her. Branches tore at her dress and face, but she pressed deeper into the shadows until suddenly the trees opened into a clearing. Before her stood a circle of tall painted tipis, their buffalo hide walls glowing warm in the afternoon light. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and she could hear voices speaking in the musical language of the Lakota people. Without hesitation, she stumbled toward the largest tipi and pushed through its entrance flap, collapsing onto the soft buffalo robes that covered the ground inside. The interior was dim and warm, lit by a small fire that crackled in a stone-lined pit. The air smelled of sage and leather and something indefinably wild that spoke of lives lived close to the earth. She was still gasping for breath when the entrance flap rustled again. A tall figure stepped inside, water droplets gleaming on his copper skin and long black hair. Even in the firelight, she could see the strength in his shoulders, the scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, and the way his dark eyes fixed on her with startling intensity. Wakiza had been watering his horses at the river when the gunshots began echoing across the valley. He'd expected to find his teepee empty as he'd left it that morning. Instead, he found a white woman huddled on his sleeping robes, like a wounded bird, her green eyes wide with terror. And something else, determination perhaps, or simple refusal to surrender. Outside, the voices of her pursuers grew louder and more aggressive. Check every tent she's got to be hiding somewhere. Spread out and search systematic like, don't let her reach the water. Wakiza's jaw tightened as he recognized the tone predators closing on prey men who would take what they wanted regardless of law or decency. He'd heard that tone before, 2 winters past, when riders had burned the tribal food stores at Standing Bear Creek, when they'd shot his beloved sister Ayana in the back as she tried to protect the winter supplies from the flames. The memory still haunted his dreams, her face appearing to him in moments of quiet desperation, as if her spirit couldn't rest until justice was served. He moved with deliberate calm, reaching for his Winchester rifle where it leaned against the tipi's curved wall. The woman flinched as he approached her hand, moving toward something at her waist, a small pistol, he realized with approval. She had courage as well as beauty. "You do not move," he said in careful English, the words learned from traders and soldiers over the years. He kept his voice low, but firm, meeting her frightened gaze directly. The sounds of the searchers were growing closer now, boots splashing through the shallows just beyond the teepee circle. The choice came to him with crystalline clarity. Under Lakota law, if she belonged to him, she was under his protection. The white men's laws would have no claim on her here, not without starting a war they couldn't win with federal troops stationed at nearby Fort Robinson. He leaned closer, his dark eyes locked on hers with unmistakable authority. "You belong to me now." The words fell between them like stones into still water. He saw understanding begin to dawn in her expression. She was educated enough to grasp that he was offering protection through legal technicality, intelligent enough to recognize salvation when it appeared. "I understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "Thank you." Wakiza nodded once, then rose to his full height and stepped toward the entrance. "Stay silent. Stay still. I will handle this." He emerged from the teepee into the gathering dusk to find 6 white men on horseback at the edge of the camp. Other members of his band had appeared from their own lodges. Men with weapons, women calling children inside the whole community, tensing for potential violence. "We're looking for a woman." Blackjack called, his scarred face twisted with impatience. "White woman, dark hair, blue dress. She's a thief and a runaway bride. We got legal right to search these tents." Wakiza stepped forward, his rifle held casually, but ready. Behind him, other warriors emerged from the shadows. His young cousin Tokala, barely 18 but deadly with a Spencer carbine. Crow Feather, whose war honors were sung around winter fires. Standing Wolf, whose steady aim had saved the village more times than anyone could count. "This is not your land," Wakiza said quietly, his English clear and cold. "You have no rights here." "Listen, Buck." Blackjack snarled, his hand moving toward his pistol. "We know she came this way. Her wagon's smashed up by the river, and there's a blood trail leading straight to your camp. Now you can make this easy or hard, but we're taking her either way." "The woman is under my protection," Wakiza replied, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "She belongs to me by our law. Your law has no meaning in this place." For a long moment, violence hung in the air, like smoke from the cooking fires. Then one of the riders, a nervous young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, shifted in his saddle and muttered something about federal complications and Indian agents asking questions. Blackjack's face darkened, but he slowly holstered his weapon. "This ain't over, Indian. Mr. Thorne's got influence that reaches all the way to the territorial capital. He's got friends in high places who don't take kindly to savages harboring white women." "Then let him come himself," Wakiza said quietly. "Let him stand before my people and explain why his men chase frightened women through the grasslands like wolves hunting deer." The riders wheeled their horses and disappeared into the gathering darkness. But their threats lingered like the acrid smell of gunpowder. Wakiza stood motionless until their hoofbeats faded completely, then turned back toward his teepee, knowing that tomorrow would bring greater challenges. Inside, he found Elise exactly where he'd left her, but her small pistol now lay openly across her knees. She'd made her own decision about trust during his absence. "They'll be back," she said simply, her voice steady despite everything she'd endured. "With more men, legal papers, maybe federal marshals who don't care about tribal law." Wakiza settled beside the fire, laying his rifle within easy reach. The flames cast dancing shadows on the curved walls as he studied her face, seeing intelligence there and pain and a core of steel that reminded him of his lost sister. "Tell me why they chase you," he said finally. "Tell me what you've done to earn such hatred from powerful men." Elise's fingers tightened on the leather satchel she still clutched protectively. "My name is Elise Laurent. My father was Jean-Baptiste Laurent. He had a cattle operation and mining interests near Crow's Landing until Victor Thorne had him murdered last spring." The name hit Wakiza like a physical blow. Victor Thorne, the cattle baron, whose operations had pushed steadily westward for years, always seeking new grazing land, always backed by territorial law and hired guns. The man whose riders had burned Standing Bear Creek, whose bullets had killed Ayanna. Lately, there had been strange reports from that area, travelers speaking of a ghostly figure seen near the burned ruins, someone who left offerings of food and water for those in need, but vanished when approached. The local people had begun calling it the guardian spirit, but Wakiza had dismissed such talk as superstition born of grief. "You have proof of this murder?" he asked, carefully pushing aside thoughts of supernatural intervention. "I have my father's papers," Elise replied, patting the satchel. "Records of Thorne's massive debts to him, contracts that were never honored, letters that show Thorne was desperate to avoid payment. And I have something else, a witness statement from the doctor who examined Papa's body. Dr. Martineau was very clear about the cause of death. A bullet in the back, not a riding accident, as Thorne claimed to the authorities." As the fire burned lower, Wakiza moved to add another log, and Elise noticed the careful way he favored his left shoulder. "You're injured," she observed. "Old wound," he replied dismissively. "From the night my sister died. I tried to reach her when the bullets started flying, but Blackjack's men pinned me down behind our horse corral. By the time I could move, it was too late." "I'm sorry," Elise said softly. "Losing family to violence. I understand that pain now." Wakiza studied her in the firelight, seeing not just grief, but a controlled anger that matched his own. "What does Thorne want from you now? Why not simply have you killed like your father? He needs me alive to make his theft legal." Elise explained, her voice hardening with bitter understanding. "Dead men can't claim debts, but mentally unstable widows can have their property managed by concerned husbands. Thorne's been spreading rumors that I'm hysterical with grief, not capable of handling business affairs. Marriage would give him legal control over everything Papa built, and then I'd have a very convenient accident within a few months. As if summoned by their conversation, footsteps approached the teepee. Wakiza's hand moved to his rifle, but the voice that called out was female and speaking Lakota. "Wakiza, may I enter?" "Come, grandmother," he replied, though the woman who pushed through the entrance flap was not old enough to truly be his grandmother. She was perhaps 50, with graying hair braided with beads and a face marked by wisdom and wariness in equal measure. "This is Winona," Wakiza explained to Elise in English. "She speaks for the Women's Council and helps make decisions about unusual situations." Winona approached Elise with the careful grace of someone evaluating a potentially dangerous animal. She carried a wooden bowl filled with stew and a cup of water, which she set down within Elise's reach, before settling across the fire from her. "She is frightened," Winona observed in accented English, studying Elise's face in the firelight. "But not broken. This is good. Broken women bring nothing but trouble to a camp." "I won't bring trouble," Elise said quickly. "I only need sanctuary until I can get word to federal authorities. There are people investigating Victor Thorne's activities." "What people?" Winona asked sharply. "A school teacher named Beatrice Coyle in Broken Creek. She's been documenting suspicious deaths of women throughout the territory. And Dr. Edwin Pike has been questioning the medical evidence in several cases." Winona exchanged a meaningful look with Wakiza. "These are white people who seek justice for Indian deaths as well as white deaths." I don't know," Elise admitted. "But they're honest people. They care about truth, not politics or profit." "We will see," Winona said, rising to her feet. "For now you eat. Tomorrow we decide if you stay or go." After Winona left Elise, and Wakiza sat in contemplative silence while she slowly consumed the stew. It was rich with meat and wild onions, unlike anything she'd tasted before, but satisfying in a way that reminded her of her mother's cooking. "The words you spoke," she said finally, "about me belonging to you. What exactly does that mean under your law?" Wakiza poked at the fire with a long stick, sending sparks spiraling up toward the smoke hole. "It means you are under the protection of my family, my clan, my people. No one can harm you without harming all of us. It also means," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "that you have obligations as well as rights." "What kind of obligations?" "To contribute to the community's welfare. To respect our customs while you are here. To be truthful in all your dealings with us." He looked at her directly. "And to trust in our protection even when it seems impossible." Elise nodded slowly. "I can accept those terms. But what happens when this is over? When Thorne is defeated, or when I'm forced to leave?" "When that time comes, you will choose your own path," Wakiza replied. "The protection I offer is not permanent bondage. It is temporary sanctuary, with mutual obligations. And if I chose to stay permanently, I mean." The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to explore. Wakiza studied her face in the firelight, seeing something there that made his heart beat faster despite himself. "That would be complicated," he said finally. "White women and Lakota men do not usually—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "Marry," Elise supplied. "Build lives together. I know it's unusual, but so is everything else about this situation. Rest now," Wakiza said, deflecting the conversation by offering her a thick buffalo robe. "Tomorrow will bring enough complications without borrowing trouble from an uncertain future." But as Elise settled onto the soft robes and listened to the sound of Wakiza's breathing across the fire, she found herself thinking not about the dangers that lay ahead, but about the unexpected possibility of finding not just safety, but something deeper in this place, so far from everything she'd known. 20 miles away in the opulent study of his ranch house, Victor Thorne was planning her destruction with the methodical precision of a man accustomed to getting his way through careful application of money and violence. She can't have gotten far on foot, Thorne said, leaning over a map spread across his mahogany desk. Blackjack, I want every trail, every creek crossing every possible hiding place searched systematically. Already got men on it, boss. Blackjack replied, a bandage covering the eye that had been damaged by Elise's sand attack. But she's smart, I'll give her that. Knows the country better than I expected. Sheriff Otto Lark shifted nervously in his chair, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening air. Mr. Thorne, what if she's already gotten word to federal authorities? What if there's marshals on the way? Thorne's pale eyes fixed on the sheriff with cold contempt. Then you'd better hope they're the kind of federal marshals who understand the benefits of cooperation, Otto. I've invested too much money in territorial officials to let a hysterical woman destroy everything I've built. What about the Indians? Blackjack asked. Word is, she might have run toward the Lakota camp on Ash River. If they're harboring her, then we create an incident that justifies military action. Thorne replied without hesitation. A few burned-out homesteads, some stolen cattle, maybe a murdered family or two. The army will clean out that camp quickly enough, and who's to say what happened to one white woman in all the confusion? Otto's face went pale at the casual mention of murdering innocent families, but he said nothing. He'd taken Thorne's money for too long to develop a conscience now. There's something else, boss, Blackjack said, pulling a folded telegram from his pocket. Got this from our man in the territorial capital. That schoolteacher Beatrice Coyle has been asking questions about the Laurent woman. Sent telegrams to newspaper editors in Denver and Omaha. Thorne's jaw tightened as he read the telegram. Then Miss Coyle will have to have an accident as well. A terrible tragedy, schoolhouse fire perhaps, with the devoted teacher dying while trying to save her pupils' schoolwork. And Dr. Pike? Otto asked reluctantly. Medical emergency, Thorne replied smoothly. Heart attack, very sudden. These frontier doctors work too hard, don't take proper care of themselves. As the three men continued planning their campaign of murder and intimidation, none of them noticed the slim figure crouched outside the study window, listening to every word with growing horror and determination. 30 miles away in the modest cottage that served as both her home and Broken Creek's schoolhouse, Beatrice Coyle was having her own war council with Dr. Edwin Pike. The middle-aged teacher had received Elise's desperate note 3 days earlier, delivered by a farm boy who'd been paid a silver dollar to carry it without asking questions. She's in terrible danger, Edwin, Beatrice said, spreading Elise's message across her kitchen table, along with her own carefully compiled evidence. Victor Thorne has already murdered her father, and he won't hesitate to kill her if she threatens his empire. Dr. Pike adjusted his spectacles and studied the documents with professional precision. These medical reports are damning, but they're also incomplete. I've been investigating similar cases on my own, and the pattern is even worse than you've documented. How much worse? At least 23 suspicious deaths in the past 4 years, all following the same general pattern. Young women of property married to Thorne's associates dead within months of their weddings. Edwin's voice grew grim with suppressed anger. I've quietly examined 3 of the bodies that were buried locally. All showed clear signs of arsenic poisoning, but the territorial coroner ruled them natural deaths. Beatrice set down her pen with a sharp click. Then we have to get word to federal authorities. This is beyond territorial jurisdiction now. I've already sent telegrams to the U.S. Marshal's office, Edwin replied. But official investigations take time, and Elise may not have time. If she's taken shelter with the Lakota camp, Thorne will use that as an excuse to create violence. Then we have to get there first, Beatrice said firmly. Warn them what's coming. Help them prepare. That's extremely dangerous, Beatrice. If Thorne's men catch us interfering, then they catch us, she replied with a stubborn courage that had made her an effective teacher in a rough frontier town. Some things are worth the risk. Meanwhile, in the territorial capital, the real Agent Morrison was reading telegrams and reports that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of corruption and murder throughout the Dakota Territory. As a federal law enforcement officer, he'd seen plenty of frontier violence. But the systematic nature of what was described in these documents suggested something far more sinister than ordinary criminal activity. Sir, his deputy agent Collins knocked on the office door. Those background investigations you requested on Victor Thorne and his associates. Come in, Collins. What did you find? Thorne's got financial connections to at least 12 territorial officials, including 2 judges and the territorial marshal. He's also got interests in mining operations, railroad construction, and land speculation across 3 territories. Morrison studied the financial records with growing alarm. This isn't just murder for profit, Collins. This is systematic corruption designed to control territorial development. How many federal laws has he violated? At a conservative estimate, mail fraud, conspiracy, bribery of federal officials, violations of Indian treaty rights, and interstate transportation of stolen goods. That's before we get to the murder charges. Then we'd better move fast, Morrison said, reaching for his hat and gun belt. Assemble a team of marshals and get word to Fort Robinson. I want a full company of cavalry ready to move within 12 hours. Sir, shouldn't we coordinate with territorial authorities first? Morrison's smile was cold and professional. Considering how many territorial authorities are on Thorne's payroll, I think we'll skip that step. This is a federal operation now. Dawn came gray and cold on October 16th, bringing with it the sound of many horses and the glint of official badges. Sheriff Otto Lark sat his bay gelding at the head of a force that included not just Thorne's hired guns, but 6 territorial deputies and a man in a black suit who carried himself with federal authority. Elise Laurent. Otto's voice carried clearly across the camp, harsh in the morning air. By order of the Dakota Territorial Court, you are commanded to surrender yourself for questioning regarding theft of livestock, destruction of property, and conspiracy with hostile Indians. Wakiza emerged from his teepee, his Winchester cradled in his arms, but not directly threatening. Around the camp, other warriors took positions with the practiced efficiency of men who'd survived too many such confrontations. Women and children disappeared into the lodges, while the elders gathered to witness whatever was about to unfold. Behind Wakiza, Takala moved with silent grace toward the horse corral, where his Spencer carbine was hidden beneath a pile of blankets. Crow Feather positioned himself near the water supply, while Standing Wolf took cover behind the camp's sweat lodge. Each man knew his role in the defensive plan they'd discussed during the long night hours. Sheriff Lark. Wakiza called his English formal and precise. This woman is under my protection by Lakota law. She has committed no crime on tribal land. Your heathen law don't mean nothing Indian. Otto spat, but there was uncertainty in his voice. The federal agent beside him had been studying the camp with calculating eyes, noting the defensive positions, the number of armed warriors, the potential for massacre that would require uncomfortable explanations in Washington. Actually, Sheriff. The federal man spoke for the first time, his voice cultured and careful. The Indian Intercourse Act of 1834 is quite specific about civil authority on tribal lands. You'll need proper federal warrants to proceed with any arrests. Otto's face flushed red with anger and frustration. Agent Morrison, this woman is a fugitive from territorial justice. She's stolen property, destroyed evidence, and conspired with hostiles against lawful authority. Has she been formally charged with these crimes? Morrison interrupted coolly. Has she been tried and convicted in a court of law? Or are we discussing allegations made by a private citizen with obvious financial interests in the outcome? Before Otto could respond, a new voice cut through the tension from an unexpected direction. Perhaps I can help clarify the legal situation. Dr. Edwin Pike rode into the clearing on his steady gray mare, his medical bag secured behind his saddle, and his face grim with professional purpose. The middle-aged physician had been making his morning rounds when he'd heard about the confrontation developing at the Lakota camp. His arrival was no coincidence. He'd been quietly investigating Thorne's activities for months, disturbed by the pattern of suspicious deaths among young women of property. Dr. Pike. The false agent Morrison nodded with forced respect. What brings you here so early in the morning? Professional obligation and civic duty. Edwin replied calmly, dismounting with careful dignity. I've been treating Miss Laurent for injuries sustained during her flight from what can only be described as attempted kidnapping and forced marriage. That's a very serious allegation, Doctor, Morrison said carefully, his federal training evident in the way he weighed each word. It's a very serious crime, Edwin replied without hesitation. One that appears to be part of a disturbing pattern involving Mr. Victor Thorne and several other young women of property throughout this territory. The words hit the gathered lawmen like stones thrown into still water. Otto's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but the fake agent Morrison's sharp look froze him in place. What pattern are you referring to, Doctor? Morrison demanded, his professional interest clearly aroused. Edwin reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document with the careful precision of a man who understood the weight of evidence. A preliminary report I've been preparing for the Territorial Governor's Office. 9 cases of highly suspicious deaths among recently married women over the past 3 years, all of whom had inherited significant property, all of whom died within 6 months of ceremonies performed by known associates of Mr. Thorne. You're talking complete nonsense. Otto snarled, but his voice carried less conviction than before. Am I? Edwin's tone remained professionally calm. Then perhaps you can explain why 3 different physicians found clear evidence of arsenic poisoning in bodies that were supposed to have died from riding accidents or sudden illnesses. The federal agent's face had gone very still, the expression of a man who suddenly realizes he's stumbled onto something much larger than expected. But this Morrison's reaction was different from what Elise remembered. There was calculation rather than genuine concern in his pale eyes. Doctor, are you formally alleging a conspiracy involving murder for financial profit? The impostor asked. I'm stating it directly and unequivocally. Edwin replied, his voice carrying the authority of medical expertise and moral conviction. And I have documentary evidence to support every single claim. That's when Elise herself stepped from the teepee, her chin raised defiantly, despite the torn dress and tangled hair. The morning light revealed the full extent of her ordeal, cuts on her hands, from driving through rough country, bruises on her arms from the wagon crash, but also an unbroken spirit that shone through the physical damage. Dr. Pike is telling the absolute truth, she said clearly, her voice carrying across the clearing with surprising strength. Victor Thorne murdered my father to avoid paying his debts. Now he wants to murder me to steal what Papa spent a lifetime building. That's a mighty serious accusation, girl. Otto challenged, but his bluster was wearing thin. You better have proof to back up words like that. Elise opened her father's leather satchel with deliberate care and withdrew a thick sheaf of papers. Business contracts showing Thorne owed Papa over $40,000 in mining equipment and cattle purchases. Bank records proving Thorne couldn't pay without selling land he'd already mortgaged to other investors. And this, she held up a single sheet covered in careful medical handwriting. Dr. Martineau's complete autopsy report clearly stating that Papa died from a gunshot wound to the back, not a riding accident as reported to the authorities. The false agent Morrison moved closer to examine the documents. But something in his manner made Elise step back instinctively. This wasn't the same man who'd spoken so professionally just moments before. There was something predatory in his pale eyes that reminded her uncomfortably of Victor Thorne himself. Miss Laurent, the impostor said with false sympathy. I can see you've been through a terrible ordeal. Perhaps you should come with me to a safe location where we can discuss these allegations in detail. I'm perfectly safe here, Elise replied firmly, moving closer to Wakiza's protective presence. Before the situation could escalate further, another voice interrupted from the edge of the clearing. Perhaps we should all discuss these allegations together. Everyone turned to see Beatrice Coyle riding toward them on her sturdy mare, her graying hair pulled back severely, and her face set with the righteous anger of a teacher who discovered systematic cheating. The school teacher had been investigating Thorne's activities, independently collecting testimony from grieving families and maintaining careful records of suspicious patterns. Miss Coyle. The false Morrison nodded with growing unease. What brings you to this remote location? Beatrice's sharp eyes studied the supposed federal agent with undisguised suspicion. I received word that there might be trouble here, and I came to offer my assistance to genuine federal authorities. Her emphasis on the word genuine was unmistakable. She reached into her saddlebag and withdrew a thick, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting. Names, dates, witness statements, and financial records regarding 19 suspicious deaths in the past 4 years. All young women of substantial property, all married to men with direct connections to Victor Thorne's business operations. All deceased within 8 months of their wedding ceremonies. This is absolutely preposterous, Otto protested, but his voice cracked on the words. Is it really? Beatrice fixed him with a schoolteacher's withering stare. Then perhaps you can explain why you've consistently refused to investigate any of these deaths, Sheriff. Perhaps you can justify why you've repeatedly ruled them accidents despite clear medical evidence to the contrary. And perhaps, a new voice added from behind the group, you can explain why you're impersonating a federal agent. Everyone spun around to see the real Agent Morrison approaching with a squad of genuine federal marshals and a company of cavalry from Fort Robinson. The authentic federal officer was younger and taller than the imposter, with the bearing of a man accustomed to wielding legitimate authority. But Victor Thorne, the real Morrison announced, as his men surrounded the imposter and his associates, you are under arrest for conspiracy murder, impersonating federal officers, and approximately 24 other charges that we'll discuss in detail during your trial. The man in the black suit tried to run, but federal marshals tackled him before he could reach his horse. As they dragged him to his feet, his expensive clothes and cultured manner couldn't disguise the desperation of a cornered criminal. This is outrageous, Otto protested. That man is a legitimate federal agent. I've seen his credentials. Forged credentials, Morrison replied calmly. Just like his commission and his warrant. We've been tracking this impersonation scheme for weeks. The revelation sent shockwaves through both camps. Elise felt her knees go weak with relief and terror in equal measure. They had been moments away from falling into Thorne's trap, saved only by the timely arrival of legitimate federal authority. But even as the immediate crisis passed, everyone present knew that Victor Thorne himself was still free and dangerous. A man who would go to such elaborate lengths to capture one woman would not give up easily. Where is Thorne now? Agent Morrison demanded, his attention focused on Otto Lark. I can't. Otto stammered, sweat pouring down his face as he realized his position had become untenable. You can and you will, Morrison replied with steel in his voice. Federal charges of conspiracy to commit murder carry the death penalty, Sheriff. Your only hope of avoiding the gallows is complete cooperation. As the federal marshals secured their prisoners and established a perimeter around the camp, Wakiza approached Elise with concern evident in his dark eyes. Are you hurt? He asked quietly. No, she replied, her voice shaking with reaction. But we're not safe yet. Thorn won't give up. He'll try something else, something more desperate. Her words proved prophetic. Even as the federal marshals were organizing their prisoners, a new threat was materializing in the form of armed riders approaching from multiple directions. Thorn had anticipated the possibility of federal intervention and prepared a final, desperate gambit. Riders approaching from the south. Tokala called from his position near the horse corral. At least 20 men, heavily armed. More from the east, Standing Wolf added, and they're carrying torches. Agent Morrison quickly assessed the tactical situation. How many warriors can you field? He asked Wakiza. 15, maybe 20 if we include the young men who aren't fully trained, Wakiza replied. But we know this ground better than they do. My marshals are good fighters, but we're outnumbered, Morrison admitted. If Thorn's brought his entire organization, then we make our stand here, Wakiza decided. This is our land, our people, our fight. As the two forces prepared for battle, Elise found herself thinking not of the immediate danger, but of the chain of events that had brought her to this moment. Her father's murder, her desperate flight, her unexpected salvation in a Lakota Tipi. All of it had led to this final confrontation between justice and corruption, between truth and greed, or whatever happens. She said to Wakiza as they prepared defensive positions, I want you to know that I don't regret coming here. You saved my life and you gave me hope when I had none left. And you gave me a reason to fight for something larger than revenge, he replied, checking his rifle's load. Whatever comes next, we face it together. The battle, when it came, was swift and decisive. Thorn's men, expecting to face only lightly armed Indians, found themselves confronting disciplined federal marshals supported by experienced Lakota warriors who knew every stone and tree in the area. The torches that were meant to burn the camp were turned against their bearers when Tokala and his companions circled behind the attackers and created panic in their ranks. But it was the arrival of reinforcements that truly turned the tide. The slim figure that had been listening outside Thorn's study window the previous night was Ayana Wakiza's sister, very much alive and carrying information that would destroy Thorn's empire forever. Ayana. Wakiza's voice was barely a whisper as his sister emerged from the creek bed where she'd been hiding her rifle, still smoking from the shots that had scattered Thorn's eastern assault force. Hello, brother, she said simply, her voice carrying 2 years of pain and determination. I've been waiting a long time for this moment. The reunion would have to wait. Even as the immediate battle ended with Thorn's forces in retreat or surrender, the man himself appeared at the edge of the clearing with a small group of his most loyal followers, including Black Jack Murdoch and 2 other gunmen whose reputations made strong men nervous. Very impressive, Thorn called out, his cultured voice carrying across the battlefield. But this ends now one way or another. He was holding a stick of dynamite with a lit fuse positioned so that any attempt to shoot him would result in an explosion that would kill dozens of people. His pale eyes held the desperate gleam of a man who had nothing left to lose. You've destroyed my organization, killed my men, ruined my reputation, he continued. But I still have enough explosive here to take half this camp with me when I go. So here's my final offer. Give me the woman and the documents, and I'll leave peacefully. Refuse, and we all die together. Agent Morrison started to respond, but Elise stepped forward before anyone could stop her. I'll come with you, she said clearly, but only if you let everyone else go unharmed. Elise, no. Wakiza moved to intercept her, but she was already walking toward Thorn with steady steps. It's the only way, she said over her shoulder. I won't have innocent blood on my hands. But as she approached the desperate cattle baron, Her hand found the small glass vial Dr. Edwin had given her, nitroglycerin intended for heart patients, but effective for other purposes when properly applied to disrupt carefully planned schemes. "Close enough," Thorne said when she was still 10 feet away. "Toss the documents over here, then we'll discuss the rest." Instead of complying, Elise threw the small vial directly at Thorne's feet. The chemical explosion that followed was smaller than his dynamite would have been, but large enough to knock him off balance and extinguish the fuse that threatened everyone's lives. In the confusion that followed, federal marshals and Lakota warriors moved with coordinated precision. Blackjack Murdoch managed to get off one shot before Tokala's Spencer carbine ended his criminal career permanently. The other gunmen surrendered when they realized their employer was no longer in a position to pay their wages. Victor Thorne himself survived the explosion, but with injuries that left him unable to continue his resistance. As federal marshals secured him with heavy shackles, his pale eyes fixed on Elise with undimmed hatred. "You think you've won?" he snarled, blood streaming from a head wound. "But there will be others like me. Men who understand that power belongs to those strong enough to take it." "Perhaps," Elise replied, standing over him with quiet dignity. "But they'll have to get past people like us first, and we're not as easy to defeat as you thought." The trials that followed lasted 6 weeks and drew newspaper reporters from across the nation. Victor Thorne, facing overwhelming evidence of multiple murders and criminal conspiracy, maintained his innocence, despite the testimony of dozens of witnesses and the documentary evidence that painted a clear picture of systematic corruption. Otto Lark's confession proved particularly damaging to Thorne's defense. The corrupt sheriff, facing his own appointment with the gallows, decided that cooperation with federal authorities was preferable to execution. "He paid me $200 for every family I drove off their land." Otto testified, his voice barely audible in the packed courtroom. "$500 for every woman I delivered to his associates for marriage. And $1,000 for every death that needed to be ruled accidental." "And how many such deaths were you paid to ignore?" the federal prosecutor asked. 23 that I know of for certain," Otto replied. "Maybe more. Thorne didn't tell me about all his operations." Ayanna's testimony proved even more devastating. The young woman who had supposedly died 2 years earlier described Thorne's systematic campaign of murder and theft in vivid detail. Her words carrying the moral authority of someone who had literally risen from the dead to seek justice. "After the bullet knocked me unconscious, I woke up hours later buried under the bodies of my friends and family," she testified. "I crawled away into the woods and hid there for days, barely alive. When I finally recovered enough to think clearly, I realized that everyone believed I was dead. I decided to use that advantage to gather evidence against the men who had destroyed my community." "How did you survive for 2 years without being discovered?" the prosecutor asked. "There are many places to hide in the Badlands," Ayanna replied. "And there are people, both white and Indian, who helped me when they could. Travelers would find food and water left for them at difficult river crossings, or discover that someone had repaired a broken wagon wheel during the night. I became the guardian spirit that people talked about around their fires. And during those 2 years, you were gathering evidence. I watched. I listened. I followed Thorne's men and documented their crimes. I learned to read and write English well enough to understand legal documents. And I waited for the right moment to reveal myself and help bring them to justice." When Elise took the stand, she spoke not only about her own ordeal, but about the larger pattern of corruption that had terrorized the territory for years. Her testimony was clear, detailed, and devastating in its implications. "He told me that my father's death was an unfortunate necessity," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom. "That cooperation was always preferable to resistance, and that those who opposed his vision of progress would find resistance very unhealthy." The verdicts were unanimous on all counts. Thorne was sentenced to hang along with Blackjack Murdoch, Otto Lark, and 4 other key conspirators. The sentences were carried out on December 15, 1879, bringing final justice to their many victims. With Thorne's criminal empire destroyed and legal justice served, Elise faced a new challenge, deciding what to do with her father's restored property and her own future. The answer came to her during a community meeting in Crow's Landing's rebuilt church, as she looked out at the faces of people who had suffered under Thorne's reign of terror. "I want to establish something different here," she announced to the assembled farmers, ranchers, and townspeople. "Not just a business or a ranch, but a genuine community where different peoples can work together for mutual benefit." "What kind of community?" asked Hugh McCrae, a struggling homesteader whose family had been driven off their land by Thorne's men. "One based on cooperation instead of competition," Elise replied. "Shared resources, mutual protection, common purpose. My father's property can serve as the foundation, but it would belong to all of us who choose to participate." Dr. Edwin Pike, who had emerged from the trials as a hero for his role in exposing Thorne's crimes, nodded approvingly. Pooled resources could support proper medical facilities, schools that serve all children regardless of background, and shared grazing rights would benefit both white settlers and the Lakota bands, Beatrice Coyle added. "If they're interested in such an arrangement." All eyes turned to Wakiza, who had been listening quietly from his position near the back of the church. He stood slowly, his presence commanding respectful attention, even in the mixed crowd of whites and Indians. "My people have always believed that the earth belongs to all living creatures," he said carefully, choosing his words with diplomatic precision. "That no single person can own the grass, the water, the sky, or the animals that depend on them for survival. But we also understand that white law sees these matters very differently." "This wouldn't change legal ownership," Elise clarified quickly. "It would simply change how we use what we own. Together, instead of separately with mutual benefit, rather than individual competition." Wakiza nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "We would seriously consider such an arrangement if it were built on genuine respect and equality rather than charity or pity. Respect absolutely goes both ways," Hugh McCrae said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of hard-won experience. "We work together and share the benefits, or we fight each other and all lose everything. I've seen what fighting gets us, and I'm ready to try something different." The vote was close, 54 in favor, 41 opposed, but the Ash River community was officially established on January 1, 1880. Over the following months, it gradually expanded to include families from across the region, united by shared hardship and common purpose. The physical work of building an integrated community proved challenging, but the emotional and social work was even more difficult. Generations of mistrust, prejudice, and conflict couldn't be erased overnight, simply by signing cooperative agreements. There were heated arguments, frustrating setbacks, and moments when the entire enterprise seemed ready to collapse under the weight of its own ambitions. The first major crisis came in the winter of 1881, when a particularly severe blizzard cut off communication between settlements and threatened the community's carefully managed shared resources. Some members began hoarding supplies, old survival instincts overriding new community agreements. Maybe this whole experiment was a mistake, Elise said during one bitter evening as she and Wakiza huddled around their fire in the cabin they'd built together. They had married in the spring of 1881 in a ceremony that blended traditions from both cultures and symbolized the community's success in bridging old divisions. "People are different," Wakiza agreed, adding another log to the flames. "But so are the fingers of a hand. Different shapes, different purposes, but they work together when the need is great enough. And when the need isn't so obvious, then they rest, but they remain part of the same hand," he replied, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned to see beyond immediate circumstances to larger patterns. The crisis passed as spring returned, bringing with it renewed commitment to shared principles. Fences were mended, both literal and metaphorical. The community's first integrated school was established, taught by Beatrice Coyle and serving children from both white and Lakota families. Dr. Edwin Pike's medical practice expanded to become a proper clinic, serving the entire region, without regard to race or ability to pay. Their daughter, Mary, was born during a late spring snowstorm on March 15, 1883, arriving with her mother's green eyes and her father's dark hair. The baby became an instant symbol of the future. They were all working to create a generation that would grow up taking cooperation and integration for granted as the natural state of human relations. She'll never know the world we came from, Elise mused as she nursed the baby on their front porch, watching community members from both cultures work together to plant the season's crops. She'll help create the world we're becoming. Wakiza corrected gently, stroking his daughter's tiny fist. Each generation builds on what came before, but they also have the chance to build something better. By 1890, the Ash River community had become something unique in the American West, a genuinely integrated settlement where racial boundaries had been replaced by shared purpose and mutual respect. Visitors came from across the nation to observe their methods, while newspaper articles spread their story to readers throughout the country and beyond. The community faced its greatest test during the economic depression of 1893, when banks failed and businesses collapsed across the nation. The Ash River community, with its diversified cooperative economy, weathered the crisis better than most places, but they couldn't avoid all consequences. Several member families faced personal financial ruin when outside investments collapsed. The community's own reserves were strained as demand for assistance exceeded available resources. For the first time since its founding, the settlement faced the possibility of genuine dissolution. This is when we discover what we're really made of, Elise told the emergency council meeting called to address the crisis. Now 39 years old and showing silver threads in her dark hair, she had become the community's unofficial leader through 15 years of growth and challenge. When times are good, anyone can cooperate, she continued. When times are hard, cooperation becomes a conscious choice that requires real sacrifice. The community chose cooperation. Members with resources shared with those without. Profitable enterprises subsidized struggling ones. Individuals took on extra work to support community needs, while the community supported individuals facing personal crises. "Nobody gets left behind" became the unofficial motto of their Depression-era response. We succeed together, or we fail together. The strategy worked. By 1896, the Ash River community had not only survived the economic crisis, but emerged stronger than before. The shared sacrifice had reinforced bonds of mutual dependence and demonstrated the practical value of cooperative principles under extreme stress. "We've proven it works," Dr. Edwin Pike observed during the celebration that marked the end of the crisis. Now in his 60s, but still practicing medicine with undiminished dedication, he had become something of a legend for his role in both exposing Thorne's crimes and building the community that replaced his empire of fear. "We've proven it can work here with these people under these circumstances," Wakiza corrected gently. "Whether it can work elsewhere with different people facing different challenges remains to be seen." His words proved prophetic. As the 19th century drew to a close, delegations began arriving regularly from universities, government agencies, and reform organizations throughout the United States and Europe. The Ash River community's success had attracted international attention as a potential model for addressing racial tensions and economic inequality in rapidly industrializing societies. Some attempts to replicate their model succeeded brilliantly. Others failed spectacularly. The difference Elise and Wakiza learned through painful experience lay not in the specific mechanisms of cooperation, but in the willingness of people to subordinate individual gain to collective benefit. You can't impose cooperation from outside, Elise explained to a delegation of German social reformers in 1899. It has to grow from within, from shared necessity and mutual respect. You can create conditions that encourage it, but you can't force it. As the new century dawned, both Elise and Wakiza found themselves reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them from that desperate night in 1879 to their current position as respected elders of a thriving, integrated community. They had proven that love could indeed bridge any divide that partnership could overcome, any obstacle that people from different backgrounds could create something beautiful together. Mary Laurent Wakiza, now 17 and preparing for her own adult life, had grown up in a world her parents had helped create but could never have imagined. For her, integration wasn't an achievement to be celebrated, but a natural state of affairs to be maintained and improved upon. "What are you most proud of?" Elise asked Wakiza one evening as they sat on their porch watching their daughter play with a group of neighborhood children that included every race and culture represented in the community. "That she doesn't see the differences the way we did." Wakiza replied, his arm around his wife's shoulders, despite nearly 20 years of marriage and the challenges that had tested their relationship in countless ways. "For her, this is just normal." "Which means we succeeded," Elise agreed. "We changed what normal looks like." The words spoken in crisis, "You belong to me now," had evolved into something freely chosen and mutually treasured. We belong to each other and to something larger than ourselves. In building their community and their marriage, they had created a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. Proof that different peoples really could work together to build something better than what had existed before. The storm that had brought them together in violence and desperation had long since passed, replaced by the calm that comes after victory and the satisfaction of a life dedicated to justice, love, and the radical proposition that cooperation was stronger than conflict, that understanding was more powerful than hatred, and that two people working together with shared purpose could indeed change the world.